Thank you for joining us for this special edition of our monthly webinar. I am Cheryl Dara-Boychuk, Chief Architect of FundsV. Today we celebrate Data Privacy Day, which is an international awareness effort to encourage Internet users to be smart about sharing online and also to motivate organizations to make data protection a greater priority. And as we'll see, there are a few different types of fraud in international admissions, some related to data privacy, big data, speed data, and data manipulation. Unfortunately, we don't need to look very far for examples of fraud in our field, namely in the form of data manipulation. Just last week, the Pi News reported that the number of student visas canceled by the Australian government has more than tripled in the last 2 years as instances of falsified test results and or financial documents have soared. Of course, there's plenty of blame to go around. Some colleagues explained that the malpractice often involves non-genuine education agents. Others noted that the alarming statistics are an unintended consequence of changes in Australia's streamlined visa processing, which reduces evidentiary requirements regardless of the applicant's country of origin. Just this morning, the ISEF Monitor elaborated on the story in its weekly Wednesday highlights. So the point is there's a problem in the industry that must be addressed. The good news is solutions exist, and true innovation happens when two distinct disciplines rub up against each other. In this case, we've married the international education industry with the financial services industry. Let's begin with what we know. Most of the fraud within international admissions anywhere in the world occurs in the very beginning of the international enrollment management lifecycle. That's true for students heading to the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, and other leading host countries. So early on, we have two primary admissibility indicators. Is the student prepared from an academic perspective? And also, can the student prove sufficient funds to meet the requirements of the federal government? Now, depending on the host institution's policies, that proof of financial capacity piece can be placed early in the admission cycle to improve your yield or conversion from initial student inquiry to financially qualified applicant. Or the funds verification piece can come later after the student has been admitted from an academic perspective. So those two indicators are key to the process. Not surprisingly, there are many parallels between authenticating academic documents and financial documents. In both scenarios, the process is always evolving and varies from country to country, as of course consumers are transitioning from paper-based bank statements to electronic bank statements. So in some ways, the transcript evaluation might be more difficult because older documents may still be legitimate. Financial documents, on the other hand, must be very current, in most cases just 90 days old. That's one of the few differences, though. So in both cases, the evaluator must ensure the utmost integrity of the process. First, confirm the identity of the student by requesting current official forms of photo identification and cross-reference the names on each document. As we see here, there's a rather lengthy list of unacceptable forms of identification. I co-presented a NAFTA session with a credential evaluator a few months ago, and she shared some pretty creative stories about students who couldn't come up with an official ID. So when a financial sponsor is involved, the evaluator must confirm his or her identity as well, obviously, and authenticate their documents accordingly. Probably the most popular issue here are name changes, which of course happen regularly. It's just a matter of documenting officially those name changes. So if fraud is suspected, then the evaluator has to document which type. From our experience, alteration is the most common form on financial statements where information on an authentic statement has been changed. So these types of fraud, by the way, were originally defined by ECE, that's Education Credential Evaluators based in Milwaukee, in the academic transcript environment. So World Education Services, otherwise known as WES, is another major credential evaluator who recently published a paper, How to Obtain Authentic International Academic Credentials, where they declare in no uncertain terms documents that students have touched are generally considered not official. So here's another way to look at it, complements of this scale adapted from ECE. Electronic verification of data is the most secure. The international education industry will eventually arrive at the greenest stage, where host campuses and host government agencies will receive direct confirmation from the educational institution in the case of academic transcripts, or from the financial institution for funds verification in response to a request from the authorities over a secure electronic network. So at this point, the industry is undergoing a transition prior to arriving at a truly paperless process. In the meantime, FundsV has introduced a sophisticated hybrid of electronic transfer of data over a robust platform, which involves more than 4,000 banks within our network. For those with bank accounts outside of our network, or for those who do not bank online, we've introduced a document management solution which involves trusted colleagues in selected metropolitan areas overseas who can confirm the authenticity of financial documents in person prior to the student uploading them into their FundsV profile. So exactly how does that work? As we'll see, there are a few different ways that the FundsV functionality can be deployed. In terms of educational institutions using FundsV, Lewis University outside of Chicago participated in our 2-year pilot and continues to use FundsV as their preferred method for students to prove financial capacity. So from the that.edu domain, the university explains the requirement and basically says you can prove sufficient funds the old-fashioned way by sending us paper documents, or you can point your online banking data to us through FundsV. So in this example, the student follows that unique link to Lewis University's portal within FundsV. All data generated via that unique URL is shared only with that host institution which originally referred the student to us. So the student is presented with 3 options to satisfy the requirement. The first 2 options involve the electronic transfer of banking data if the student's or sponsor's bank is part of our network of nearly 4,000 banks. And you can always access our most current list of banks via our bank affiliation link that's accessible on every page within FundsV from the lower left corner. So here's a sample of a few of the 4,000 banks within our network from which we can ping accounts with appropriate authorization from the account holder. So you'll see we represent some of the most popular banks in the world, including more than 60 from India alone. So here's our output page there on the right. FundsV users can grant authorization that allows us to retrieve their 90-day account balance history from the most recent day the user granted access to 90 days prior. We retain records of completed and submitted student profiles and the dates they were submitted. Now that becomes extremely valuable when the application process extends over several months, because it'll be pretty obvious if there's a huge deposit at some point rather than a relatively steady flow of consistent income. So FundsV provides a clear alternative to the current practice of bank statements with logos, seals, or signatures that can be pretty easily manipulated. So why does that matter? The very latest data reveals that 65% of the 886,000 international students currently in the United States cited personal and family funds as their primary source of funding to pay for their tuition and living expenses. So in the vast majority of cases, bank statements were used early in the admissions process to satisfy the requirement to prove sufficient funds. So really, what's the big deal? What happens if we get this proof of sufficient funds wrong? Well, failing to prove sufficient funds is one of the most common reasons that U.S. consular officers deny student visas, and that's probably true for other host country destinations as well. We've got to get it right. So the flip side of that same coin, if the student submits fraudulent documents and is actually granted a visa, but the student shows up without money, different campuses have different policies, but I think it's safe to say that those scenarios represent a significant disruption in the office. So privacy and security issues, of course, must be included in any worst-case scenario. I continue to be amazed at how flippant some of our colleagues are with regard to handling bank account data. A couple of months ago at the NAFSA conference, I ran into an old friend who advises students in Africa, and she and her colleagues are just begging for a formal, standardized platform to transmit their students' bank account data. She knows that email attachments can be intercepted for nefarious purposes, so her solution is to use her own personal Dropbox folder to share these very sensitive documents. Of course, she has the best interests of her students in mind, but that process is pretty risky. And increasingly, strategic risk analysts recognize that the most immediate threats to your security may not be from hackers or system vulnerabilities, but from human error or carelessness. So what else happens if we get it wrong? There's this issue of perception that's increasingly important, especially as institutions struggle to differentiate themselves from their peers in a very crowded, information overload type of marketing environment. So if you're still demanding that students send you notarized paper bank statements, how can you claim that your campus is so innovative, particularly when there are robust platforms to satisfy that requirement? So let's go a little further with that perception issue. The international admissions flow is complicated enough. Obviously there's plenty of room for improvement to ultimately retain more of those prospects that you worked so hard to attract to your site. So I would suggest that process may be even more critical than promotion in terms of true competitive advantage. This Forbes article noted that consumers crave simplicity, particularly when it comes to substantial purchasing decisions like an education abroad. So I ran across these statistics a couple of months ago. The attrition rate for international students is the worst among all other categories of applicant type. And I think the main reason applicants fail to complete an application is that it's just so darn complicated. I mean, of course, there are a few more steps. But, FundsV helps to simplify the process so you can improve the conversion of initial inquiry to financially qualified applicants. So let's dig a little deeper into the specific features of FundsV that facilitate the fight against financial fraud in international admissions. So the growth of online banking now allows for the secure electronic transfer of data where we can track who has opened the file and when, so there's greater opportunity to detect fraud. Secure platforms can purge all data immediately after pinging the account via our trusted network, which adheres to the highest standards for financial institutions. What's fascinating to me is how students and parents and sponsors are embracing this sense of empowerment to proactively control their digital data. So consumers, are realizing that they don't need to remain passive and simply hope they don't become victims to some hack. As a matter of fact, 70% of U.S. consumers said they felt more confident that they knew how to manage their privacy than just a year ago. The bottom line is that consumers themselves are more engaged in the fight against fraud. So with regard to the financial services industry, research shows that people who bank online review their accounts 4 times as often as those who bank on paper, facilitating early detection of fraud. So here's more good news. Millennials especially are embracing a sense of empowerment to proactively control their digital data. So they're emerging from this victim mentality. These statistics from StaySafeOnline.org confirm that millennials don't trust the government to keep them safe. 87% believe that the individual user is responsible for keeping the internet safe. So where does FundsV fit into these overarching trends? First, with identity authentication. FundsV employs the most robust security and privacy methods used by the world's leading banks, informed by Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering guidelines. We tap into a secure network used by over 700 leading financial institutions and companies and more than 50 million consumers around the world. So we enable users to enter their account credentials just as they would to access their account at the bank's portal online. So this approach serves to authenticate the user's identity, and the user is always in charge of restricting access to their data at any time. So the detection of duplicate access has been another extremely helpful function. There may be a legitimate reason for duplicate access, such as two siblings pinging their parents' account, so we don't automatically disable any profiles. We simply alert both the student and the institution and provide a comment section for the student to explain any irregularities. So lastly, multiple balance verifications. In just a few minutes, bank account holders from any of the 4,000 banks in our network may refresh their 90-day balance histories within their FundsV profile, enabling qualified students and their parents or sponsors to substantiate their financial capacity over time. So FundsV keeps a historical record each time a student submits their completed profile to their authorized host institution. So the admissions counselor can pretty easily see, if there's that steady stream of income, or if the proverbial red flags pop up for one reason or another. As we've seen, the biggest challenge these days is balancing the risk and security of information technology. So we've got the open access argument there on the left. That's the open, free-flowing data streams that our student applicants have grown to expect. On the other side of this teeter-totter is the institutional perspective, where information assets need to be fully protected or locked down. It's a very sensitive balancing act. So in terms of other market trends, we've already seen that students are really embracing this sense of empowerment over their digital footprint. Qualified students would love to elevate their applications above the very crowded applicant pool. And that's why we see a number of English proficiency video services percolating, particularly from China. So another interesting trend, in some cases, embedding the FundsV functionality goes beyond the .edu domain. It's actually even more useful if FundsV integrates into current software programs as part of a larger ecosystem. So that's where an API comes in, an application programming interface where the student or sponsor may use the FundsV functionality without having to leave that particular site. So examples of such collaborations include academic credential evaluators, English proficiency evaluators, qualified agents, overseas recruitment fair organizers, payment processors, really any service that's involved in the international student flow, particularly when generating initial interest in study abroad. And they want to further qualify those prospective students from a financial perspective. So that's who can benefit from FundsV. So there's a lot happening. To keep up, we invite you to join our LinkedIn group. If you'd like to schedule a customized online demo, we can certainly sync our calendars for that. We do have a few scheduled events coming up. As a matter of fact, every month we offer open online demos. The next one is slated for Thursday, February 12th, where we will update our working group. That group was assembled at the request of SWIFT. That's the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, based in Belgium. They asked us to assemble that group to develop global standards for funds verification within global student mobility. You're also welcome to join us for our annual breakfast on that Wednesday during NAFTA week, of course this year in Boston. So for our very latest itinerary, please go to our About page at FundsV. We are just about at our 20-minute mark. Of course, if you have any questions, you can contact me directly. We certainly look forward to continuing to facilitate the fight against fraud. Be sure to check out Data Privacy Day activities online. We posted some resources via our Twitter account, so you're most welcome to review those. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again for joining us.